Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and my guest today is the wonderful Juliet Sharman-Burke. And I have no problem saying the wonderful because the book that Juliet has written is rather wonderful. And if you are having trouble reading, the title is The Family Inheritance: Parental Patterns in the Horoscope. Welcome, Juliet.
Thank you.
So this book is, as I say, really very lovely. And the reason I like it so much is because it's very easy to read. Um, Tell us how you came to work on this.
Well, it's a very old book. It goes back to the 1990s, mid 1990s. And during that time, the CPA, the Center for Psychological Astrology, were doing weekend day seminars at Regent's College. And there was a great demand for recordings for those seminars in those days because everything was non-technological then. And we used to record the seminars, and people were always asking for tapes. But they were quite difficult to make and they weren't very good. And in the end, we thought, well, hang on a minute, why don't we just turn them into, well, transcripts, really, so books. So the seminars were transcribed and printed. So I think it's probably easy to read because it's got lots of audience participation, which is nice because in that situation, the seminar, the lecturer, whatever you want to call them, is able to kind of participate with the audience. And in those days, we used to get big audiences. It was a really kind of wonderful time for astrology because we were teaching every weekend. Liz Green, myself, Lynn Bell, Darby Costello, all the teachers from the CPA were giving weekly seminars. And so we used to get lots of people, and there were lots of interesting questions coming up and lots of different case histories, and that's what's in the book.
And I am so grateful that they were recorded and transcribed and put into books because I don't know that there's many I haven't come across. I hadn't come across yours, but Erin Sullivan, who we've had on before she passed. Been looking at Liz Green's wonderful books as well this year, and of course there was Howard Sass-Portis's books.
Yes.
Also.
Yes. Lovely.
Are in combination with Liz Green. So there's just such a wealth of material that came out of those seminars. I, who could not be there at the time, am just so grateful for it all. So one of the wonderful things that you do in the book is you start talking about the mythology that illustrates how, let's call them family curses, are passed on from one generation to the next. So the family inheritance being, not a big pile in the country, but something else.
Sadly.
Yes. And you describe this myth beautifully, the House of Atreus. Tell us about that.
Well, I think that is such a useful myth to think about family inheritance and the family therapy. When you're in therapy, family therapy particularly, you go back not just your parents, but your parents' parents and your parents' parents. And, you start seeing there's no good in sort of blaming people. It's something that's happened, and eventually there's often what they used to call the identified patient, who would be the one who carried the family curse and was also sort of required in a way to lift the family curse, which in the House of Atreus was Orestes. He ended up being the one who went mad for the family in a way, and then was released. But it's a very complicated myth, and it goes down from generation to generation. and you keep getting the same patterns repeating. So I think it's very useful when you're thinking about everyday families, although they're not nearly as bloody. Well, some of them are actually, to be honest. There are some awful, awful stories today, but a lot of families aren't quite as devastatingly awful as that one. But some of them are, and I think it's really, I guess, what the point is to say this is part of human nature in its best and its worst, and that's what all the myths capture.
That's right. And, this is a brilliant myth that you chose to feature. But even, just looking at the pantheon of the gods, you have Saturn doing something to Uranus, who then kind of curses Saturn. And then Saturn does exactly the same thing to Jupiter, who does exactly the same thing that Saturn did to Uranus to Saturn. And it just, it's that self-perpetuation of let's call it the family myth even.
Mm-hmm.
It's a belief that comes in. And what I also find very interesting, and good about your choice is, of course, that Orestes goes mad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because it was only a few weeks ago, speaking to Richard Swarton, we were talking about R.D. Laing's book, Sanity and Madness in the Family, and where exactly R.D. Laing points this out exactly, that there is the person who is seen as mad in the family, who's taken out of the family, makes a nice recovery, goes into the family and goes mad again. So sometimes there is something, and it's not a word that I like to use lightly, there is something toxic that is passed on to the one individual. And we could also look at the myths around scapegoats, as that can happen too. But it has to end somewhere. And it's, as you say, when we take that responsibility for our own sanity and well-being, that goes beyond just blame, because when we blame, we're just going to pass it on to the next generation. But it's the buck stops here with me, and I'm going to put this into a context so that I understand that this is a family curse and maybe not as personal to me as I thought.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think what R.D. Laing says about the identified patient, the one in the family that carries all of those projections in a way. And in the myth of Orestes, he's got nothing to do with his parents' quarrel. In the myth, it's Agamemnon and Clytemnestra who are struggling. He wants glory for his fleet, and so he says, "Send me a daughter, I'll have her married," and he intends to have her sacrificed. And Clytemnestra thinks she's sending her daughter to get married and discovers that her husband's going to basically kill her to give her to the goddess, and isn't very happy about it. So, understandably.
How shocking, a mother not willing to go along with this.
Not. So, and then in the end, when there's the murder and everything, it's all very dramatic. But basically, Orestes is stuck in the middle, as most children are, between warring parents. And they're saying, well, this isn't fair. This has nothing to do with me. But the trouble is, because you are a son or a daughter of that family, it is to do with you, because that's your fate, if you like.
You're there.
You're there. You have to be there. It wasn't your fault, but it is your fate. Exactly. And you have to then somehow decide what you're going to do with that. Are you going to repeat it by sort of striking out and lashing out at everybody who upsets you? Or are you going to have to decide what to do? And after a year of torment, Orestes goes to Athena and says, "I can't do this anymore. Help me." So she's, I suppose, like the archetypal therapist in a way. And she says, "Hang on a minute, this isn't right. Let's look at it." And gets the jury, the first jury of humans, to judge the actions of the gods. and she casts her vote in favor of Orestes, because obviously half the women vote for the life of the mother being most important, and half the men think the father's life's most important. And she casts in favor of Orestes and says, he's suffered enough, let him go. And he does.
And it's, I think, very telling that he goes to her, goddess of wisdom.
Yeah. And justice.
And justice, exactly. War, but also justice and wisdom. So I think that's very telling. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to come back to in the myth, but I think before that, this idea of one child being the patient, you know, the carrying the family curse. I'm not sure that it's just one child. My experience makes me feel that all the children are carrying it, but a different one. So so that the children are playing a different role of carrying a different aspect of this. So, you know, here we have this poor young girl, you know, Orestes' sister. She's playing a role too. She's the sacrificial lamb.
Yeah.
And in families, we see the one who plays that role. And then Orestes, of course, is carrying yet another one. You could say he's a bit like the scapegoat, because he's the one that gets blamed for it all, because he is stuck in the middle and takes an action which he has to pay for. So you can see that. And I think that's the other very powerful thing in the myth, is that it's not just one role. And I feel that that's very true in families, that they play, the different children are like subconsciously, of course, assigned different roles for transmitting or dealing with this family trauma.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think it depends on I suppose in ordinary families rather than mythic families, although they're probably more or less the same thing. The makeup of the child, the sensitivity, and also their chart, and how it interacts with the parental, how the parents see that child. Orestes is given a choice. Choose, you know, who are you going to punish? You have to. Apollo appears to Orestes and says, "Your mother's murdered your father. You have to avenge your father's death." But the Fury says, if you kill your mother, who happens to have killed your father, then you're going to have to answer to us. And so he's put in this impossible position, and he says, you know, actually, it's nothing to do with me. I don't want to murder anybody. I didn't choose this. And they said, sorry, you're the son. You have to decide. You're either going to avenge your father, in which case the Furies will get you, or you'll refuse to do that, in which case Apollo will punish you, because he's on the side of the father. And so children find themselves in those situations quite a lot. And you'll find that children will align themselves with one or other parent. And you find that, you know, one child is the father's supporter, or the other's the mother's supporter. And when you get split families, you know, divorces or separations, you know, you can find that one child will absolutely never speak to the father again when he remarries, and the other child will say, oh, I'm going to just make friends with the stepmother. It's okay.
There is something else too, you know, when you were talking about the identifying with one parent rather than the other. And that is that very often children who are abused will identify with the abuser rather than the other parent. And I think, you know, that's sometimes a survival mechanism. I'll identify with the powerful one, because then maybe I'll be protected. But often there's also a lot of anger for the fact that the other parent didn't protect them. And coming back to Orestes, you know, that was a classic double bind. You know, it's a double bind. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because And that's very often what happens as well to children, is that they are put into these double bind situations where they're told, okay, this is the right thing to do, but if you do it, you're going to be punished. And then the other option, well, you're going to be punished for that as well. And that's exactly what he was doing. Apollo is operating, it's not necessarily that he's favoring Agamemnon, he's operating under laws. Then so are the Furies, and he's going to fall foul of both. So this is why I felt the choice of myth that you were working with was so powerful, because there's so many different strands of family dynamics that are in there. I think, gosh, weren't our ancestors clever? These stories, they really are quite.
I mean, I think that's the most wonderful thing about myths, particularly, well, all myth actually, but the Greek myths are so rich psychologically. And then you can see the fairy tales coming down from those, which are also the true fairy tales, the good old Brothers Grimm, very grim, some of them, are really just reflecting in story form something that otherwise is very unpalatable. But in story form, you can kind of understand it a bit better about human nature.
And that is the sad thing about the sanitization of the folk tales.
Yeah.
Folk tales weren't necessarily meant for children. They were like myths, they were for adults, and they spoke of human experience, as does folk music. Folk music and traditional folk music, there's a lot of sad stories there, because they're speaking of what it's like to be human, not just in a particular time, but in circumstances that are recognized throughout time. So this is the value of them. Just coming back to the myth once again, I really like what happened with the Furies. Tell us about that, because I think that's really powerful.
Well, being told that they could be named, because the Furies were not were so awful, that these three women with snake hair and that would drive you mad, particularly through your dreams, and they would just haunt you. And they were so awful that you couldn't speak their name. They couldn't, she, like Voldemort, he who cannot be named. So when Orestes sort of said, okay, I'm going to clear Orestes, I'm going to vote in his favor, but I will give you another name, the friendly one, so that you can actually be acknowledged. You can be, you're not just going to be ignored or hidden or put under the carpet. You can actually have your identity, although, you're pretty tough ladies, but nevertheless, you can be spoken about. You can have a name, the Erinyes. So I think that's, that was actually acknowledging that aspect of the feminine, the furious feminine. We hear about nothing like a woman scorned. The feminine is a very powerful force.
I think too that this is a very important thing, because to me, what that speaks of is the destructive quality of guilt. Orestes does commit a heinous crime. He murders. It's not just that. Obviously, people think it's aggravated because it's his mother, but murder is murder. And whatever the circumstances, however much you might sympathize, murder is murder, and he is going to be living with that guilt. And as you said, the Furies haunt you in your dreams. And that's exactly what guilt does. And guilt does drive people mad. The therapist side of me sees it all the time. It's one of the most, I would say, guilt and shame, the most corrosive emotions. And sometimes they are not warranted.
Mm.
You know, okay, in Orestes' case, he did do something heinous,
Mm.
but there needs to be some compassion for the extenuating circumstances.
Mm. I think that's right. I mean, I think that's exactly why that myth is so powerful and so clever. And it describes how, how we are in these sort of terrible binds where we're sort of forced into a situation or find ourselves in situations where we end up doing terrible things.
Compassion is necessary. And what I love about that ending is that the Furies are named.
Mm.
That to me is an act of compassion.
Mm. Mm.
But it's also a reminder that when the guilt or shame are brought out into the open, named, the beginning of healing, true healing, is there.
Yeah.
And then there's hope. Once they're named, then there's hope.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly it. And that goes for all, human people that end up in your consulting room and my consulting room. That's where the healing starts. But it's the responsibility and it's the accepting of one's own actions. There has to be self-compassion, self-understanding and forgiveness, and hopefully forgiveness from others. But it's you first of all have to own your guilt.
Yeah, you do.
And that's a really different. I think Jung very famously said to one of his patients who came into his consulting room and said he was having an affair and felt very guilty. And Jung, mind you, Jung can talk, but Jung did say to him, "Well, you deserve your guilt."
And sometimes we do.
Exactly. When we do something wrong, then we have to feel. We feel guilty, which is different from remorse. I think remorse is different. When you have remorse, you're sorry about actions that you didn't necessarily intend to commit. But when you do something deliberately, then you do have to face your guilt.
There's a line in Pride and Prejudice. Now I'm trying to think whether it's the book or whether it's the 1990s TV series that was of the book, but either one, or both maybe. But there's this great line when the father realizes that his youngest has eloped, and that her reputation along with the family's is now completely and utterly sunk. Because it turns out not only did she elope, but actually they're not quite married. So the news is out, the gossip is out, and he's sitting there, and he says to his eldest Lizzie, who tried to warn him that it was not a good idea to just allow Lydia to go off to have some time away from the family with friends because she could see what was happening. He said, "Well, you were right." But there's this lovely line where he says, "Well, I'm heartily ashamed," he said, "but never mind, the novelty will wear off soon enough." And so he's in that book as his daughter is, obviously very concerned for him because he's really beating himself up about it. But he says, "Oh, well, the novelty will wear off soon enough. So let me, I forget what the words are exactly, but basically, let me wallow in it for a while because I deserve this."
It's a beautiful line.
It is, isn't it? I think of that a lot in different things that crop up. When we have done something, we have to own it, take responsibility for it. Unfortunately, sometimes we are carrying guilt that is not ours, and we don't even know it. Just there, passed on through the family line, and who it belongs to is not even remembered anymore. And I think also there is another element which is the social context in which family trauma first arises. Because history has been brutal, and it doesn't seem to brutality doesn't seem to be abating anytime soon. This has an impact on individuals, and that's how family traumas begin. And I think, again, going back to the myth, there is big stuff that's happening here. You know, the war, the Trojan War, the Trojan War is not Orestes' fault either. He wasn't there. He didn't make it happen. Somebody did, and it was an act of the gods, actually, that made it happen. It was Aphrodite and Hera's and Athena's own vanity. The vanity of three goddesses led to the Trojan War. And never mind blaming Eris, they should have all known better, you know.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Who do you get? You know, who gets to carry the can? I mean, they're all responsible, and they're all. But vanity is a very interesting. It's a very interesting point, because when you think about how many wars are started through the vanity or ego, if you want, of the leaders who are fighting for this thing or that thing.
And that just made me think how neat and appropriate it was that it was Athena.
Yes.
Actually stepped in and ended this. Because actually the buck did stop at with those three goddesses. They were responsible. And I think that's the other powerful thing then about the myth, is that it is showing that sometimes normal human beings get caught up in things that are not their fault and are out of their control. And they become embroiled in these affairs and dragged down. And then we have the trauma that gets passed down through the generations. And just it's a stunning myth that you chose there. And so it's very, very apt. And we've just spent all this time talking about the myth because it's so rich.
Yeah.
But when we're looking at the chart, and obviously we're looking at the 4th, 10th house axis and the sun and moon, is there something that you see in a chart that tells you, this is the person that is now compelled to end it all?
That's really difficult. I wouldn't like to say about that, actually. I really wouldn't. But what you can see in a chart is when somebody really has got very tricky parental issues going on from the 4th to 10th with the sun and moon, with the outer planets sometimes. And, you know, I think working with family dynamics, working with individuals on a psychological level it's a very delicate process. And, you know, astrology has a wonderful lens to look through. But I think one has to be careful how one goes about it. And you do kind of need to know a little bit what you're doing when you're going into those very, very difficult areas. So I would always say caution, but once you can, if the client is willing to go there and wanting to go there, they can get an awful lot out of it. And I think the myths and the stories can help put it into a context that you can think about. In the same way as that's how the folk tales work and fairy tales work, and they do work for children if they're allowed to look at difficult myths, that life is quite hard. But when you put it in a story with some sort of resolution, you can think, okay, I can do this. So I think that's how it works.
I agree. And it is, as you say, an incredibly delicate process. Um, but you're right. You look at a chart and you can see, um, it's just, it seems that lines were popping into my head today. But there was this television series a while back called Roger Roger.
Mm.
And is John Sullivan, who also wrote Only Fools and Horses. But this one line at one character says, "Some get the magic, some get the tragic," and and you look at that fourth, 10th house axis, and you can see sometimes who's got the tragic. Well, actually, very often you can see where that tragic line is, and I would say that when we see that, rather than rushing in with certainty, that's where we go, okay, let's take a step back, take a deep breath, and think how we're going to delicately begin to unravel this story.
Mm.
And as you say, using story is one of my favorite ways of getting people to engage and start thinking, oh, okay, yeah, maybe I can see that. I can see, and slowly it begins to come out.
And I think that's one of the, using bits of stories, even with clients in therapy, using some of those little lines from stories is so useful and so helpful. And it's just, that's what makes me very sad nowadays, is that, well, certainly children and lots of adults don't even know that, those myths, those stories, which means that they've got there's a whole thing that they can't actually access.
And it is different. And you make this point in the book, actually. And I think you're absolutely right. It is different to film because film, the rate of frames per minute puts people into a hypnotic state. And if it's watched in the cinema, it's meant to be an immersive experience. So all the lights are out, surround sound, to make it as real as possible. And what that means, I think, is that you can be so immersed in it that you lose the ability to look at it more objectively and think critically. Whereas when you're reading, you could be really in that story, but the lights are on and you're in your room, and maybe you could still hear somebody in the kitchen. And so you can step out and think a bit more, I think. And you're right, in film, it gets much more imprinted in the mind. And that might not always be the healthiest way.
Well, I think the thing is, I remember a long time ago when they used to have Woman's Hour. No, not Woman's Hour. It was Listen with Mother, where stories would be listened, and children were supposed to sit with their mothers and listen to the stories on the radio. And the little boy said, "I prefer the stories because they're better pictures than they are on television."
Yeah.
Because obviously you make your own picture when you're hearing a story told to you. You create a picture in your head of what's going on. When you see it and on screen, you're given an image. And if you don't, and that's why people say, "Oh, read the book first before you watch the film," because you'll have the film version of the character in your head when you're reading the book afterwards. Sometimes it's a good thing, but quite often, sometimes they do film stories very well, but a lot of times the person isn't quite what you imagined.
And also, I think the thing about when you're reading these stories versus watching is that you can reread parts.
Yeah.
Um, and it's less likely that you're going to do that, particularly in these days of downloads, where you're not necessarily going to rewatch.
Mm.
So I think that's the other thing. So it's the processing. The processing is what we're talking about, and what we're processing here is very complex human relationships, very complex human experiences and dynamics, told in a larger than life way, because our brains seem to understand that better, but it also creates a bit more of a distance. It feels a bit safer. These are the myths.
Yeah, they're myths, and and I think that's the thing. The thing is that when you talk, I mean, when you're giving a lecture for a seminar, for example, the minute you start telling a myth, everybody's quiet. They're just completely absorbed in that mythic story because it's archetypal and it resonates and it's part of our collective unconscious.
It is both extremely powerful, but safe at the same time. And
it's comforting on some level.
Exactly. What makes it safe is that although we can relate to it, there's enough distance between us and the story. And whether it's somebody telling us a story or us reading the story. And that's where it's very different from film, where you're completely in the story. You're so immersed in it, you're so lost in it, that it becomes a part of your subconscious. And you don't even know it. And that's
you don't sort of choose what the film comes at you, and you can't unsee things. Whereas when you're reading something, you can go over it, and and it's in black and white, so it's kind of safe. Whereas film can jump out at you, and the images can stay with you in quite an intrusive way. Whereas it's much safer to read a difficult story, I think, than. But of course, now we're so overwhelmed with imagery.
So this is the power of story, and this is also the importance of using story to help us make sense of the human experience, and in particular in your book, focusing on the 4th and 10th houses, the sun and moon, and the aspects to them, and what planets are in those two houses. And so I would urge everyone to rush out and get themselves a copy of The Family Inheritance, Parental Patterns in the Horoscope, the link to which will be in the description box. And if people want to find you, Juliet, how do they do that?
Well, it's quite difficult. I'm on the Center for Psychological Astrology website. I'm not really big on social media, so I don't have a website of my own. But you can contact me through the Center for Psychological Astrology, and it's Juliet at cpalondon.com. That's the email address that people can get to me on. But I'm afraid I'm a bit of a dinosaur, really. I don't have an Instagram page or
an email address. It will do just fine.
That's just you can just get straight to me that way. But I don't have any TikToks or.
No, that's okay. What I'll do is I'll put your email address.
You can put that on if anybody wants to contact me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for watching. And next time we're going to be looking at Chiron. But before I sign off completely, just a little word to say that I have started a Substack, and I'll be putting a link to that in the description box. You will find lots of weird and wonderful things like the Teddy and Mummy adventures, which are really about me and my dog, as well as things that I'm writing about plants at the moment. They seem to be calling me. And of course, there are things about astrology too. So do check it out. And I'll have that link, as I say, in the description box. Until next time, goodbye.